what made you want to write this book? Let's start there.
Well, so I've been very interested in food and farming issues since really I worked on an intensive pig farm when I was a teenager. And yeah, I like hard physical work, but this was a really grim place. I mean, it was like the seventh circle of hell. It was a horrendous place. And I was there for 3 months, and every day there were two thoughts came into my mind, which first of all is, this isn't what they told me farming was about. And secondly, why is this legal? Because if we treated cats or dogs the way that we treat farm animals, particularly the pigs and chickens that we cram into these massive steel factories, we would be sent to prison. And yet we've normalised this. We've normalised this utterly brutal, horrific treatment of farm animals because, well, we want to eat them. And we eat 75 billion of them every year. And this is just the way things are. You know, very few people question it, except for, you know, those who have made that big shift towards vegetarianism or veganism. The great majority of people, you know, deliberately don't question it. There's a sort of deliberate turning away from these issues, because if we face them, we would have to change. And there's a remarkable statistic I came across when I was researching the book, which is that while 95% of Americans eat meat, in one survey, 47% of them wanted to ban slaughterhouses, and which gives us a really good impression of our cognitive dissonance. So, to begin with, I was horrified by the treatment of the animals, but it planted the seed of curiosity in my mind. You know, if we can do this, something that's so obvious, so obviously wrong, morally wrong, what else can we do in the name of farming? What else is going on that we're not paying attention to? And it turns out the answer is just about everything. That you can get away with things in farming that you would never get away with in any other industry. You know, there's so many cases I've come across where I thought, if this were the chemicals industry or the fossil fuel industry, horrendous as they are, but if they were doing this particular thing, we would have massive demonstrations in the street, you know, which we need to in all of those sectors, obviously. But somehow there's a sort of moral force field around farming with a big no trespassing sign on the outside, and we don't go there. We don't want to know.
Yeah, I saw in some of the talks you've done about this book, you mentioned this thing about farming and how it's sort of culturally ingrained in a way that few other more maybe exploitative industries are. Why do you think that is?
So I'm very interested in the work of a cognitive historian called Jeremy Lent. He wrote a wonderful book called The Patterning Instinct, which I very strongly recommend, and another one called The Web of Meaning. And he talks a lot about root metaphors, about the ideas that are so deeply implanted in our minds that we don't recognize them as ideas. We just say, this is the way the world is. Or we don't even say it. We just follow the cognitive pathway which has been laid down for us before. And we don't deviate from that path, because if we deviate, you know, as I know and as you know in your work, it's painful. You know, you have to screw up your mind to think about it, and then you have to screw up your courage to go there and to say things which are outside the normal frame of thinking. And he describes it like a path beaten through the long grass. And it's very easy to follow that path, but if you stray from that path, you have to find your own way through the long grass. And that's a particularly appropriate metaphor in this case, because you know, you can think of the path that livestock have beaten through the long grass. And this is, you know, we've been farming livestock for thousands of years. We've been farming for probably about 12,000 years altogether, the earliest farmers. And it's become so deeply embedded in our culture that to question it is to question ourselves, is to challenge our own identity. And it's particularly the case when it comes to livestock grazing, the cattle and the sheep grazing on fields. This has been valorized by a very long cultural tradition. There's a secular poetic tradition which goes back to Theocritus in the 3rd century BC, looking back to his native Sicily from Alexandria, where he was living, and nostalgically creating this world which even then did not exist. You know, all the shepherds do, they sit under the trees, they play music, they have sex with each other, they don't actually do any work. And he conceives this, despite all the sex, and there's a lot of sex in Theocritus, he conceives this as a place of innocence and purity, whereas the city where he is evil and corrupt. And this theme gets picked up by Virgil, who then moves the action to Arcadia in Greece, which is a real place, but it's also become a mythic place, where there's Pan's realm, and the shepherds all besport themselves with the nymphs, and you've got this intense sort of innocence created. And then you've got the parallel tradition in the Bible, with the people who wrote the Old Testament were the descendants of herding peoples, and they look back with nostalgia to when Abraham's herds darkened the plains. And of course, one of the earliest stories of all in the Bible is about the conflict between herding peoples and arable farmers. Abel, the beloved of God, was a herder of beasts, and Cain was a tiller of the ground. And the story of pastoralism is, we're against those settled peoples who till the ground, and that conflict has always been there. And then, of course, when Jesus comes along, he's both the Good Shepherd and Agnus Dei, the Lamb of God. And then these two traditions come together very powerfully in the European Renaissance, with Dante and Petrarch, Boccaccio, right across southern Europe. I don't know about Sweden, I have to admit, but it gets picked up big time in England by Spencer, by Mary Herbert, Christopher Marlowe, Shakespeare, of course, in As You Like It, who plays delightfully with those themes. And that continues as a very strong poetic tradition until the 18th century. Then it dies away, and then, at any rate in England, and again I don't know how it is in Sweden, it comes roaring back in the 20th century in two different forms. One of them is books for very young children, pre-literate children, and literally 50% of them are about livestock farms. But not a livestock farm that any of us would recognise. Livestock farm with one rosy-cheeked farmer, one horse, one cow, one pig, one chicken, one cat. They all talk to each other, and there's no indication of why they might be there or where they might be going, understandably. And so again, it becomes this place of safety and comfort. And if anyone then later challenges the idea of livestock farming, you're challenging, ourselves. This is deeply embedded in our own souls. This idea that we are these people who have this delightful dream of livestock farming, and it's exact. What the children's books show is the exact opposite of what it really is, which is why it was such a shock to me when I first started working as a teenager, because actually in my mind, even though part of my mind knew that it wasn't like that, but in a deeper part of my mind, it was meant to be like that. It was the children's books, it was a storybook image, and it could not have been further away. It was an image of hell. And then the second strand, which developed in the 20th century, was TV programs fetishizing sheep farmers and cattle farmers. I don't know if you have that here, but in the UK, if the BBC were any keener on sheep, it would be illegal.
Yeah. So I understand that one of the problems obviously is this sort of romanticized image of what farming entails, and the ethics of obviously like large-scale animal production. But would there be a problem? Because I know you advocate for an entirely plant-based solution for food.
Plant and microbial based.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No.
So hypothetically, what is the problem with those? Because they do exist, like the small-scale farms. What's the problem with that? Could we not decentralize the existing animal production? So
there's two forms. We can divide animal farming into two forms. There's the intensive farming and the extensive farming. And what you're talking about falls into the second category of the extensive farming. Now, we know about the horrors of intensive farming. I mean, I've been talking a little bit about them already. Added to the animal welfare horrors which really are horrific. I mean, they really are. You know, there's a reason why we're not allowed into these places. You know, and you often get farmers saying, "Oh, if people understood more about farming, they'd be more sympathetic to us." I think, oh no, they wouldn't. You know, if we were allowed into those farms and into the slaughterhouses where the animals are killed, none of us would ever eat animal products again. You know, it would just be it, bang, finished. You know, you couldn't do it. You know, unless you'd somehow managed to shut down your mind, you just couldn't do it. Seeing what goes on in these places, particularly the slaughterhouses. But it's not just that. There's a massive environmental issue. So, for example, well, all intensive livestock have to be fed with grain, right? They're sitting in a factory waiting for the feed to come to them, so you have to grow that somewhere. As a result of livestock farming, huge tracts of the planet are being cleared to plant the crops which are being fed to the animals. It's a very inefficient way of feeding us because you lose a lot of the food value when it's passed through the animal because the animal metabolizes. It has to create lots of body parts which we don't eat. There's all sorts of losses along the way. So if you look, for instance, at central and northeastern Brazil, almost the entire Cerrado ecosystem, which is this tremendous savanna ecosystem, a really crucial one, has been destroyed by soy farming to feed mostly to chickens and pigs, often in rich nations. An area the size of Spain has been cleared there for soy alone. Similarly, in the Gran Chaco in Argentina and Paraguay, in the southern Amazon rainforest as well, these enormous soy plantations. And so great is the impact of those soy plantations. It's beginning to have global effects. So it affects the circulation of water around the globe now because it's cut off one of the main, what they call rivers in the sky of moist air circulating around the world. But also, so much fertilizer and soil is now leaking off those fields and into the great rivers which flow northwards, such as the Tapajós and the Tocantins and the Xingu, and then into the Amazon, that now, for 6 months every year, a continuous band of floating sargassum weed, which used to be confined to tiny little patches, forms from the Gulf of Mexico all the way down Central America, halfway around South America, right across the Atlantic to the shores of West Africa. A continuous girdle of weed, 9,000 kilometers long. That's a quarter of the way around the planet, and that's fertilized by this massive flush of nutrients going down the rivers and out into sea, what we call eutrophication, an excess of nutrients. Then when we bring the grain over here and feed it to the animals in these factories, they poop a lot of the nutrients out that the grain contains. And that shit that they produce is in huge quantities, can't be economically trucked out of the area because it's high volume and low value. It's not worth the diesel to take it more than about 5 or 10 kilometres away. And so farmers spread it on their own fields. But there's far too much for the soil and the plants to absorb. And so the majority of it then washes off into the nearest river. And so you get these symmetrical effects where it kills the rivers here too. And no river can withstand a concentration of intensive livestock farming. So you say, okay, we hate intensive livestock farms. Everyone can agree on that, even people who eat the products of intensive livestock farms every day. And the great majority of animal products that we eat in rich nations come from intensive livestock farms. We don't want to know that. We pretend it's not happening. We shut our eyes to it. That is the reality. So a lot of people are now saying, well then, if the problem is intensive farming, the answer is extensive farming. And we should be eating grass-fed meat. We should be eating cattle and sheep, which live out in the pastures. And look at them. Look at these beautiful pictures. Resonate with those deep stories that we tell ourselves. So deep we don't even see them as stories. And look, they're in harmony with the living world. It's mimicking nature. It could not be more wrong. In fact, grass-fed meat is the most damaging of all the major food products we eat. Much worse than palm oil, much worse than any of the other harmful things we eat. It is the major driver of ecological destruction on Earth today. It's the main driver of habitat destruction, of deforestation, of wildlife loss, of species loss. It's a major contributor to soil degradation and to climate breakdown. And the reason for this is, well, the primary reason for it is what I think should be the most important of all environmental issues, but is massively neglected by environmentalists: land use. Now, there is an aspect of land use with which environmental campaigners engage, and we should engage with it, it's important, and that's urban sprawl. Right? And urban sprawl is a very bad thing. It's bad for cities, it's bad for the countryside. But the entire urban area of the planet, all the homes, all the businesses, all the infrastructure occupy 1% of the planet's land surface. Farming occupies 38% of the planet's land surface. That's pretty well all the land which isn't desert, mountain, ice, forests and protected areas. All the rest is farming. Of that, just 12% of the land surface is under crops, and nearly half of those crops are being grown to feed to livestock rather than directly to humans. So what about the other 26%? What's that? That's all livestock grazing to produce a tiny fraction of our food. It's an immensely profligate form of land use. And what that land use carries with it is two things of enormous importance: carbon opportunity cost and ecological opportunity cost. Now, opportunity cost, of course, means the lost opportunity to do something else. And so on every hectare occupied by an extractive industry, and by far and away the biggest form of land use that humans do today and have ever done is grass-fed meat. Every hectare it occupies is a hectare that cannot be occupied by a wild ecosystem, such as forests, wetlands, savannas, natural grasslands, all of which are massively richer in wildlife, in biodiversity, and richer in carbon than the pastures which have replaced them. And so even where it's long established, as it is in Sweden or the UK, by maintaining that system, you are shutting the opportunity to draw down large amounts of carbon from the atmosphere and to restore ecosystems. But because of the global demand for pasture-fed meat, pushed a great deal by food writers, by celebrity chefs who frankly do not know what they are talking about because they don't understand numbers. It's all aesthetics, it's all elite taste, oh, I love this, so everyone should be eating it, with no idea, that you cannot feed a 21st century population on a Neolithic production system. They promote this, and it's as a result, there's this massive push of pasture-fed meat production into the most biodiverse places on Earth. In Brazil, in Ecuador, in Madagascar, in Myanmar, in northern Australia, massive, continuing, ongoing destruction driven by livestock farming, extensive livestock farming. And extensive, incidentally, means using more land to produce a given amount of food. That's the definition. And so this supposedly beautiful, harmonious system, ranching, is actually the most destructive thing of all. Now, there's been this massive PR campaign, greenwashing campaign by the meat industry, and they've rebranded it as regenerative ranching. Regenerative ranching, formerly known as ranching. And regenerative is a word like sustainable that you just stick in front of anything you're already doing. And hey presto, you've solved it. It's no longer a problem. It's regenerative, it's sustainable, hooray! And words are very cheap. In fact, they cost nothing whatsoever. You just stick a word in front. And there's this myth which has received massive traction in the media, and even some environmental campaigners aligning with the meat industry have been promoting this myth that cattle pastures sequester carbon. And yeah, they can add carbon to the soil, but the greenhouse gases they produce greatly overwhelm any carbon that they add to the soil. And the system as a whole sequesters far less carbon than the natural ecosystem which would have been there if you weren't grazing your animals there. And that's another thing, that grazing livestock produce far more methane and nitrous oxide, which are both very powerful greenhouse gases, than livestock which are kept indoors, even cattle. So corn-fed cattle is a disaster in all sorts of ways. Pasture-fed cattle is a much bigger disaster, much higher greenhouse gas emissions, much higher land use, much higher carbon and ecological opportunity costs. There was a study published in Nature looking at what would happen if we all did what the celebrity chefs tell us to do and swapped corn-fed beef for pasture-fed beef, got all the cattle out of the feedlots and into the wider world, and found you would have to expand the area used by cattle in the United States by 270%. You'd have to demolish all the cities, you'd have to cut down the forests, you'd have to drain all the wetlands, you'd have to water all the deserts, you'd have to de-gazette all the national parks, and you would still have to import a lot of your beef from Brazil, which they already do.
Yeah. So obviously this explains why you are advocating for a plant-based diet broadly. So what is the problem with the existing alternatives? Because you're suggesting something else in this book.
Yes, that's right. So yeah, I mean plants have a plant-based diet has much lower environmental impacts, and of course much lower impacts on animals than an animal-based diet. And so it's the best thing you can, and there are two things you can do as individuals, which are switch to a plant-based diet and stop flying, which are the two biggest things you can do. We are much more powerful when we act collectively. They're always trying to turn us into consumers rather than citizens. And it's when we get together as citizens that we're most powerful. But if you're going to act by yourself, and I strongly recommend that most of the time you don't, but if you're going to, those are the two top things you can do to reduce your environmental impact. Now, we also have a lot of problems in plant farming. Not nearly as big, because it doesn't sprawl across so much of the planet. It doesn't cause agricultural sprawl in the same way that livestock farming does, but even when you're producing food directly for human consumption, there are the fertilizers, there are the herbicides, there are the pesticides, there's the irrigation water, all of which are imposing impossible demands on planetary systems and have gone way over the line. I mean, if we all switched to a plant-based diet, we would have a far smaller cropping area. Not only would we eliminate all the pastures, but we would, according to a study in Science, we would reduce the total amount of arable crops by 19%, because while we'd be eating more grain directly, we wouldn't have to produce all the grain to feed to the animals. And on a smaller area, with the rate of pesticide use rising, the enormous amounts of nitrate, phosphate and other fertilizers being added, irrigation water is already maxed out, and we're looking at ramping up the extraction rate. Well, it's just impossible. It doesn't exist. The water's not there. So, we need radical reform in the way we grow plants. And there are some very exciting possibilities. I'm really excited in particular by the potential of perennial grain crops. Right, so nearly all the grain that we eat, and by grain I mean cereals, peas and beans, and oil seeds. Those all together represent grain. Nearly all of it comes from annual plants, in other words, plants which live and die within 1 year. Now, large areas covered by annual plants are very rare in nature, and they generally occur after an ecological disaster, like a volcanic eruption, a landslide, a big fire. And what annual plants are very good at is occupying bare land. They seed very quickly, they reproduce quickly, grow quickly, spread their seed, die off, and the seed grows the next year. And so for 2 or 3 years they can occupy that land before the perennial plants come back in, the long-lasting plants, and smother them. So in order to grow our annual grain crops, you have to create an ecological disaster every year, right? By ploughing the land or by spraying the land, and you have to create bare land, because that's where they thrive. And having done so, you then have to pamper those little seedlings as they're coming up. You have to give them lots of fertilizer, you have to kill the pests which might want to eat them, you have to kill any competing plants, which we call weeds, you have to give them lots of water in some circumstances, and look after them and look after them and look after them, and then you harvest them, and then you start the whole process all over again. And the damage we are doing to the soil, above all, which is being ripped apart by overuse, by heavy ploughing, by too much fertilizer also destroys soil structure. but also so many of the ecosystems downstream with the leakage of pesticides and fertilizers. This is unsustainable. We cannot even sustain our food supply, let alone wider ecosystems, if we carry on like this. But for around a century, scientists have had this dream of perennial grain crops. What if we could grow our grain on plants which stay in the ground for several years at a time? We could greatly reduce the impacts. And finally, this dream is being realised with sort of modern screening techniques which are used to screen thousands of potential candidates, lots of wild species, lots of potential hybridization, all sorts of things. And already, with the Land Institute in Kansas and the University of Yunnan in southern China, they have brought to full commercialization a variety of perennial rice, short grain rice with the romantic name of PR23, which has, after several harvests, still has the same yield as annual rice. And farmers are really keen to get the seed. One, because they've got a real problem with soil erosion in southern China. The terraces are slipping off the hillside and stuff because they're ploughing them every year. Well, you don't have to do that if you've got perennials, and the long roots can bind it all together. But secondly, because they're very short of labour there, and so many young people have left for the cities. And well, we don't have to plant it every year, so you massively reduce your labour costs. And I've eaten this short grain rice, and it tastes just like short grain rice. That is short grain rice. There's a whole lot of other crops in development. The other really good thing about perennial crops is that they're more environmentally resilient. So if there's an environmental shock, they're more likely to survive. And in fact, at the Land Institute in Kansas, they've been developing a perennial sunflower, and they have been growing it alongside annual sunflowers, and they had a big drought that completely wiped out the annual sunflowers, and the perennial sunflowers were fine. They just sailed through it because their roots were so much deeper, and their structures above ground were so much tougher because they'd had years to build it up. And they don't stay in the soil forever, but several years at a time, and that can really massively reduce your impact. So that's one of several very interesting new developments, but it's not enough for a couple of reasons. One, because actually we need to take the minimisation of farming a lot further if we're going to get through this century. I mean, really, I think the only hope we've now got, because of so many years of failure, is the mass rewilding of planet Earth, ecological restoration on a huge scale, bringing back the forests, bringing back the wetlands, the savannas, the natural grasslands, the mangroves, the sea floor, the coral reefs, the kelp forests, all these missing ecosystems, which, if we did that, it would stop the sixth great extinction. It would draw down much of the carbon dioxide we've already released. Not all of it. We also have to completely decarbonise our economies. It's not either or, but we have to do both now. It's too late just to decarbonise our economies. We will certainly go past 1.5 degrees, almost certainly past 2, even if we sort of shut down all our industrial sources of greenhouse gases. And livestock farming alone is sufficient to push us past certainly 1.5 and probably 2 degrees, even if you abandon all fossil fuels. I mean, this is what's so frustrating. There are only 2 things we need to do to prevent climate breakdown, right? Leave fossil fuels in the ground, stop farming animals. 2 things. We've had 27 of these COP meetings, and neither of those aims has ever been mentioned in one of their final declarations. They had 2 jobs, and they haven't mentioned either of them. Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
Because the whole point of these meetings is to keep us talking rather than acting. That is the point. If they were serious about this, there wouldn't have been COPs 2 to 27. It would all have been sorted out at COP 1. I mean, that was how it was with the Montreal Protocol on ozone depletion. They sorted the whole thing out in one meeting. Right, end of story, business done, all the rest was just details. But in this case, they will just talk and talk and talk until the water's up to their chins. And they'll still keep talking till the water's in their mouths. Because they do not intend to act. In every one of these meetings, it's a choice. Do we save our life support systems, or do we appease our sponsors? We'll go with the sponsors. Every one of these meetings, they turn up saying, it's now or never. And they go away saying, how about never?
Yeah, I've noticed in your, I guess a lot of your talks about, writings about this, you're quite critical of as well the centralized food industry, I suppose I could call it. Do you think that is a problem, and that is one of the things that sort of makes it difficult to find political unity regarding this? Because obviously, like, monopolies are huge, and it might be difficult for politicians to go up against it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it seems to be difficult for politicians to go up against anything which involves money or involves power, you know, and the greatest threat, both to democracy and to the living world, is money in politics. Yeah. That is the number one threat. You know, that is why we can't get anything done. It's the power of money. And, you know, it's a straight fight. You know, the political fight we're in is between democracy and plutocracy. And at the moment, plutocracy is winning. And we can come on to new political tactics and things. There's lots of interesting stuff to say about that, perhaps a bit further down the line. But the question you've asked is a very important one, a very pertinent one, because there is a long series of scientific papers now, going back about 10 years, saying the global food system is looking very much like the global financial system in the approach to 2008. And these papers, you know, written by eminent scientists in very dry academic language, are basically saying, you know, because it's really scary what they're saying. They're saying this system is losing its resilience in the same way as the financial system is losing its resilience. And, you know, there's a fundamental problem. I don't know about in Sweden, but in the UK at any rate, one of the massive gaps, one of the many massive gaps in our education, is that unless you do a very specialist degree, you never get exposed to systems theory, to how complex systems work. And yet everything that's important in life is a complex system. Human brain, human body, human society, every ecosystem, the atmosphere, the oceans, the global financial system, the global food system, they're all complex systems, and they all operate in completely different ways to simple systems. Yeah, and we talked about them like with sort of circuit diagrams, like it's an electrical circuit. You know, it could not be more misleading. It does not work like that. It's like being taught Swedish and told it's Finnish. It's a totally different system. And so it's constantly taking us by surprise, like the financial crisis did. Oh my God, how did something as small as the subprime crisis in the US bring down the whole global system? Because in terms of financial flow, it was tiny by comparison to the size of the system, and there'd be far bigger fluctuations in the past, but suddenly this butterfly's wing brings down the whole thing. What was that about? And actually, there was this really beautiful bit of work done, because the Queen visited the Bank of England, our Queen, and she asked them, why did no one see this coming? And all these sort of grey-haired old men was, don't know, miss. Dog ate my homework, miss. You know, and so, but brilliantly, the chief economist of the Bank of England, he did something which I thought was really inspired. He went to one of my old ecology lecturers. I don't think it's inspired because he was ecology, but this really brilliant ecologist called Professor Robert May, who was us ecologists like to think of him as the founder of systems theory. Mathematicians at MIT might have a different version of the story, but who cares? Anyway, and so at least he was one of the great pioneers of systems theory. And what Haldane did was to say to May, what can ecology teach us about why the banks collapse? And between them, they produced the first coherent and mathematical explanation of the financial crisis. It was totally brilliant because they were looking at it from the perspective of systems theory, which actually is the only appropriate way to see it and to understand it. And what they found, you know, using some sort of pretty abstruse maths at times, but it's a consistent maths. It's a maths that's consistent across all complex systems because they behave according to certain rules. Is that your complex system, in this case your financial system, which forms spontaneously from billions of random interactions. You know, I mean, human agency gets almost lost in this. It's really bizarre, how, whatever people are trying to do, the system takes over. And there's an amazing quote in The Grapes of Wrath, John Steinbeck, right at the time when systems theory was first was a sort of hint of it, but he obviously wouldn't have had any contact with that, but he intuitively grasped it. He said something along these lines, it happens that no one in a bank wants the bank to do what it does, but the bank still does it. The bank is the monster, I tell you. And that is almost a perfect summation of complex systems, because they take over. You can't control them. You could almost believe you're looking at a form of intelligent life, even when it involves the financial system, where there's precious little intelligent life to be found. Because it has these internal dynamics. So you get billions of interactions which spontaneously form self-organization. This sort of weird self-regulation of systemic dynamics. And when that system is healthy and resilient, that self-organization damps down shocks which might attack that system. And it stabilizes itself around an equilibrium state. And it does this. I mean, it sounds like there's some consciousness here, but there are one or two conscious complex systems, and basically the brain is just one more step along that systemic development. But it's the same principle, but it hasn't, probably. The global financial system hasn't reached a stage of consciousness, and I think we could probably say that ecosystems haven't, with the possible exception of the soil, which is totally weird. I mean, the soil, what we're beginning to understand about soil ecology, we just don't understand what we're seeing. I mean, it's like contact with aliens. It's totally bizarre. So, I mean, I know I'm digressing a bit, but there was a paper published in 2020 called Soil as a Composite Extended Phenotype of the Microbial Metagenome. I'm sure you've read it. And was looking at the way in which the entire microbial genome of the soil extends in length and shrinks in length according to the carbon content, and at the same time the RNA operons rise as the DNA length shrinks, and there's some collective metabolic response going on. I mean, we have no idea what we're looking at here. It's as if the soil itself is alive. I mean, it's really, really weird. We don't understand it. We just don't understand it. And we put no money into understanding it. We spent billions of dollars on the Mars rover program to explore the surface of that planet. Wouldn't it be a good idea to spend a bit of money exploring the surface of our own? Anyway, to put that aside, these are all complex systems. They all behave in mathematically very similar ways, and there are four main elements of resilience in a complex system: redundancy, the spare capacity in that system; modularity, the degree to which that system is divided into compartments, so shocks can't easily be transmitted; allied to that, circuit breakers like fuses in an electrical system, which actually can actively prevent the transmission of shocks; and then backup systems which operate on completely different principles to the primary system. And if all of those are strong, your system is resilient and will survive. And the maths has got to the point now where you don't need to know what the system is to know whether it's going to collapse or not. You just need to look at the mathematical values of it, of its main components. And so these two, they describe the financial system in ecological terms. So, okay, it was bound to collapse. You look at the size of the major nodes, the big banks in this case, the strength of the connection between them, the way in which their behavior was beginning to synchronize as those four elements of modularity, of resilience were stripped out, the redundancy, modularity, circuit breakers and backup systems were all destroyed by corporate efficiency. So one corporation is doing, makes perfect sense for it to pursue this strategy, but what it's doing is undermining the resilience of the whole.
So there's a common pattern.
There's a common pattern.
Probably predict.
Exactly, it's predictable. And now that we understand that dynamic, we can say, here's another system that's equally prone to collapse. And the food system, they've been trying to warn us for years. The food system is looking the same. There's a few huge corporations which are now too big to fail, very strongly linked with each other. Their behaviour very strongly synchronised, all those four elements of resilience being stripped out. People say, oh yes, the food crisis created by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It revealed the food crisis. The food crisis has been there. Hunger has been rising worldwide since 2015, and for much of that period, global food prices were historically low, and yet hunger was still rising. Why? Because of the amplification of shocks across the network. So when a system loses its resilience, instead of damping down shocks, it amplifies shocks. Self-regulation, turns to self-amplification, and then it drives that system inexorably towards the tipping point. And when a system reaches its tipping point, it doesn't respond linearly and gradually, it goes like that, and collapses into a new equilibrium state. And once it's collapsed, a further principle kicks in, which is called hysteresis, which means that the energy required to reverse a tipping point is greater than the energy required to cause it. So even though the banks didn't actually collapse, they were pushed very close to the brink by the subprime crisis, which was tiny in global terms, but it took trillions of dollars to push them back into a safe space. So hysteresis had kicked in even before the collapse had happened. Now, with the global food system, if that collapses, global financial system would have been bad enough, but the food system, it doesn't bear thinking about. And it's worth reminding ourselves that governments were able to bail out the banks with future money. You cannot bail out the food system with future food.
Yeah. And speaking of sort of this problem that the system is really fragile, I suppose. One of the things in this manifesto for the Reboot Food campaign, you can pick up the manifesto outside after this, but is to open source all of the technology that is used.
Yeah.
Is that a way to decentralize and to sort of stabilize the system?
I'm really glad you made the link there, because you exactly got it right. Those two things are very strongly connected, because we have to fight corporate concentration. Whether we're looking at the existing food economy or the new food economy we want to create. So have I already mentioned this corporate concentration in the grain trade? I've been talking so much. No idea what that. Okay, so at the moment, 4 corporations control 90% of the global grain trade. This is terrifying, absolutely terrifying. And we have to break them up. And it's the same in all commercial sectors. It's monopolies have been allowed to establish because once you get rich, you just have to spend a small amount of your money and you can buy every politician you want. They've all got not all, but a lot of them have got a price tag, especially the fascists. That's quite cheap. Not hard to buy a fascist. And so the antitrust laws have been pulled down. We need strong antitrust laws, and we need weak intellectual property rights, and ideally open source, because with open source you can have distributed food production, whether in the old food economy or the new food economy. We have to decentralize it, we have to deconcentrate it, disperse it, to reintroduce some of those elements of resilience. But we also have to create different food systems running parallel to the primary system, and to bring back that those backup systems, bring back the redundancy, bring back modularity, and all the other aspects of what makes a system resilient. And so that open source is the ideal. And I know it's often hard to reach, but let's face it, a lot of the new food technologies being developed, some of which are incredibly useful, and we'll be coming to these, I'm sure, have been developed in public universities with public money. And then what typically happens is there's a little bit of development outside the university, and either the small business that develops it or the big business that takes it over snaffles all the intellectual property and runs off with it and says, this is ours and ours alone. And you say, well, why? Why should we allow them to take this? We've just given it to them, effectively. We are the ragged-trousered philanthropists who let them fleece us.
Mm-hmm. So some of this technology, like you said, we should probably get into it, and then I think we can open up for some questions, probably.
Sure.
But do you want to talk about the fermentation?
Yeah, thank you.
Because that's the other important thing.
Exactly. So by far the biggest part of the problem is livestock. Right? And what I would love is for everyone to switch to a plant-based diet. And like everyone, I want people to be like me, to eat the food that I eat. But unfortunately, that's not working very well. I mean, we are seeing in Western Europe, a rapid rise in veganism, and it's a wonderful thing. It's a great thing to see, and it does give me heart. Particularly so many young people, are rejecting the livestock industry. for all sorts of good reasons, and there's plenty of them, you know. But worldwide, meat eating is rising much faster than veganism is. So, to give you an example, in the UK, I expect it's roughly the same in Sweden, we eat on average 82 kilograms of meat per person per year. That's roughly our body weight. In the US, it's 118 kilograms per person per year. That's the meat they eat, not their body weight. Might also be their body weight. The global average is 42 kilograms, and it's converging towards the European level, which is 82. So it's, you know, we're seeing this very rapid uptake of meat eating. There's something called Bennett's Law, which is that people who are more prosperous, they eat more protein and fat dense food, particularly meat. And you know, a lot of people talk about the population crisis, and you know, human population growth is about the only environmental indicator which is plateauing. You know, everything else is doing that. Human population growth is doing that. In 1960s, it was global average 2% a year. Now it's 1% a year. It's probably going to plateau mid-century. But there is a genuine population crisis. It's a livestock population growth, because that's rising by 2.4% a year. So to put it in crude terms, by 2050 there'll be 100 million tons of extra human on the planet and 400 million tons of extra livestock on the planet. Already, of all the mammals on Earth, humans are 36%, livestock is 60%, and wild mammals by weight are 4%. And if we don't stop this trajectory, that's going to get a lot worse. So we have to try to stop this from happening, because I mean we will eat the planet. You know, we will eat all our ecosystems. We will destroy the habitable space on Earth if we allow this to continue. That is what's driving us to destruction faster than anything else. So we need urgently to find substitutes for animal products which are as much like animal products as possible, but crucially are cheaper, because this is going to be won on price. You know, moral suasion has its place, you know, and I spend my life trying to persuade people of things to with lesser or greater degrees of success, but you know, it's limited in its scope. Whereas price, you know, if you can bring in animal product or things which are just or very similar to animal products, very hard to distinguish them from animal products, that are cheaper than animal products and ideally healthier as well, then you don't need persuasion anymore. You know, it's going to sort itself out. And so the best hope of delivering this seems to be precision fermentation. Now, precision fermentation sounds a bit scary, lots of syllables, but it is really just a refined form of brewing. You know, we've been brewing microbes for thousands of years, and you know, instead of packing together animals in big steel sheds, you can pack together some microbes in a steel tank. But this is a more precise way of doing it. And we've been doing that since the 1970s. So if anyone eats cheese here, they're almost certainly eating chymosin, which is the substitute for rennet for cheese making, which we used to get from the fourth stomach of an unweaned calf that was sliced up and macerated and chemically degraded. Instead, we get it from a bacterium or a yeast, which is engineered to produce chymosin. Not a difficult choice to make, you would hope. And that we've been doing since the 1970s, no one's complained. Similarly, insulin now, almost all the world's insulin comes from the same process. Instead of mashing up pigs' pancreases, which we previously did. Vitamin B12, if you ever have that, or most vitamin supplements, they'll be produced in the same way. But the big shift now is producing protein by this means. And so multiplying microbes to produce very protein-rich flours, 60, 65, sometimes 70% protein, which can be tailored to produce specific proteins and specific fats, which can then make much better substitutes for animal products than plant-based proteins and fats can. Plant-based proteins and fats are really hard to work with. They're at low concentrations, they're very different from animal proteins and fats. They're wrapped up with all these plant secondary compounds which have strong flavours. It is a tough gig trying to make things which are like animal products from plants. It's much, much easier doing it from microbes. And either with native microbes or with genetically edited, gene-edited or genetically modified microbes, you can produce meat proteins or proteins with very similar profile, amino acid profile to meat, lipids which are very similar to the fats in meat and fish, including long-chain omega-3s and all that, and all the other components which make meat meaty and milk milky and fish fishy and eggs eggy. Though eggs are a bit harder to crack than the other components. Gets worse. And in fact, I was the first person outside the lab visiting Solar Foods in Helsinki to eat a pancake made out of microbial protein. And a small flip for man. And amazingly, it was just like a pancake. It tasted exactly like a pancake, except they had to dilute it with wheat flour. Otherwise, we would have made an omelette because it's got such a high protein content. So you know when you make a normal pancake, you start with the wheat flour and you add eggs and milk to raise the protein and fat content. Well, in this case, we had to lower it. Otherwise, we literally would have made an omelette. But this is about far more than pancakes. It's you've got the means now to put these things together to make products which are very, very similar. Now there's a parallel process going on, which is to make cellular meat, growing meat in a bioreactor. I don't think that's going anywhere. It's much more complicated, it's got far more steps. I used to think it was part of the solution, I don't think it is anymore. And you have to maintain clinical hygiene conditions, because mammalian cells multiply every 24 hours, bacterial cells multiply every 20 minutes. So if you're not clinically sterile, you get a bacterial culture. So why not work with a bacterial culture? It's much easier to work with, and it's much more productive, it is much cheaper. It's got digital style cost curves. And while farming multicellular organisms, plants and animals, has pretty well hit the bottom of the cost curve now, which is why they do all these horrible things to animals to try to get a little tiny bit more efficiency out of them. With precision fermentation, you're at the top of the cost curve and you're looking down this cost abyss where you're going to ski right down that curve very quickly indeed, because it's modular, it's predictable, it's in a factory. And there's two extraordinary things which this offers us. The first one is you shrink the footprint of agriculture to a dot. There's, in fact, Thomas Linder, who is a scientist here in Sweden, has calculated that if your feedstock is methanol, because some of these microbes, these are the ones I'm most interested in, don't need any agricultural feedstocks at all. They will eat hydrogen or from renewable electricity. So he calculated that if you grow bacteria and methanol, they need 1,700 times less land than the most efficient way of producing protein from agriculture, which is soy grown in the US. What that means is 137,000 times less land than beef production and 152,000 times less land than sheep production. This is incredible what this can do, because suddenly you can release those vast areas of the planet for rewilding, which is our only hope, possibly, of getting through the century. I mean, this is the last throw of the dice, really. Unless we can do this mass restoration of ecosystems, we are toast. We're finished. We're cooked. But the last throw of the dice is shut down livestock farming and rewild all that land, and that is sufficient to get us through and to stop the sixth great extinction, to draw down a lot of the carbon we've released. And then the second thing it can do is to step in countries which have become dangerously dependent on imports from this highly unstable global food system. And there are many countries now which are totally import dependent, particularly in North Africa, Middle East, Central America, Horn of Africa, because they don't have enough fertile land or water of their own to grow their own food. There's many other countries now whose soil erosion has got so bad that food demand has greatly outstripped food production, and so they've become import dependent. And they get their food from thousands of kilometres away. and it's getting more and more unstable. So what do you do to break that dependency? Well, precision fermentation gives you that opportunity because it can function completely autonomously. And if your feedstock is sunlight, in other words, if you're producing hydrogen or methanol from renewable electricity, then, well, all the countries which are most food insecure, they might not have much fertile land or water, but they've got a heck of a lot of sunlight. You know, it's right there. And you know, this is why we need a distributed food system. If you have a microbial brewery outside every town, it doesn't matter what's going on in the rest of the world, it can continue to function and produce protein-rich foods tailored to local markets without needing any significant imports. It can just keep going. So you've suddenly got this means of doing these two things, feeding the world without devouring the planet.
Nice name drop. So I'm sure that you have some questions.
Then with market, there is this brainwashing that universities are part of, where market will solve everything. You have a headache, you go to the market.
Yeah.
So, and I call this marketism. Would you comment on this interlink?
The first thing to say is that, you know, the degree to which a system is capitalistic or socialistic is independent of technology. You know, you can, even a high-tech, you could have a sort of socialistic high-tech system, you know, community broadband, for instance, energy collectives. You know, we see examples of these around the world. And these are all political choices. Now, you know, those of us with, you know, kind and empathetic and liberal tendencies have been losing out massively worldwide. You know, all of us out of Sweden are really shocked by what's happened here recently. We can hardly believe it. You know, we'd looked to Sweden as being the bastion of liberalism, and oh my God, you know, if it can happen here, it can happen anywhere, and it indeed is happening almost everywhere now. The fascists are getting a grip, and they're getting a grip because of the failure of mainstream politics, the failure to deliver what people need, the failure to uphold and defend people's lives, and when governments refuse to improve people's lives, all they've got left are culture wars. And as soon as you open up a culture war, you open a gateway to fascists to let them in. And you know, we can see the dynamic from the centre, from power, which is driving these disasters. But I would argue that, I mean, and with very notable and wonderful exceptions, but as movements as a whole, we have contributed to the problem because all too often, not universally, but all too often, our theory of change is wrong. And the theory of change, although it's very seldom articulated, you know, I went to a large environmental campaign group, for instance, or indeed political or human rights campaign group, and said, what's your theory of change? A lot of them would be hard put to answer that. You know, it's very seldom, it's not often overt what their theory of change is. But reading between the lines, the theory of change often seems to be something as follows. We don't have time for system change, and people would never accept system change, and we have to meet those people in the opposite corner halfway, so we have to go very cautiously and quietly and incrementally. And I've been told, you know, I've been doing this for 37 years now, and throughout those 37 years I've been told we don't have time for system change. Right? And throughout that time, the other side, the neoliberals, who have destroyed this system and let the fascists in, they have achieved total system change. You know, since Margaret Thatcher came to power in the UK, everything has changed. You know, she was quite overt about what she wanted. She said, economics is a method, the objective is to change the heart and the soul. And she did it. You know, she changed us politically, economically, socially, culturally, everything. Yeah, not just her, but you know, this whole infrastructure of persuasion that the neoliberals built. They were doing system change while we were doing incrementalism. We would say, well, we shouldn't ask for too much. You know, if we ask for too much, we'll put people off, we'll scare them away, you know, and we need to bring them all in. And, you know, persuading people in the opposite corner, that is never how change has happened. That has never, ever happened. And in order to make yourself acceptable to people in the opposite corner, you go to them. You're not bringing them to you. You, by trying to meet them halfway, you just follow them because they're not staying still. They're heading off in that direction. And you say, oh, just a moment, we'll catch up with you, meet you halfway, and then we can make friends. does not work like that. It's a completely mistaken theory of change, and yet, this is what all the big groups, the big organised groups have been doing. It's only the direct activists, really, who understand it differently. And actually, it's just wrong. It's just empirically wrong, because we now understand a lot better about how society changes, because we've begun to understand society as a complex system, which it is, and all complex systems have the same fundamental dynamics, the same mathematical relationships. And one of the properties of complex systems is that if you push them beyond a certain point, they collapse into a new equilibrium state. Now, when it applies to ecosystems or the food system, that can be a very bad thing. When it applies to society, if it's the right move, it can be a very good thing. We shift from one equilibrium state to a completely different one. And now, very excitingly, we know roughly where that tipping point is, and it's about 25% penetration of a new idea or a new perspective. And once you reach that point, for two reasons: one, because of the internal dynamics of a complex system, but secondly, because we're highly social creatures and we're always looking out for where the wind is blowing, and when we perceive it's changed, we swing round to catch that wind. And most people, for better or worse, mostly for worse, side with the status quo, whatever it happens to be. And if the status quo has changed, we don't want to be left behind, we'll side with this new status quo. Now, when we understand that, we can see that actually, it's not that person in the opposite corner we need to be reaching. All my life I've been told, don't preach to the choir. So I say, well, who else should I preach to then? Who else is listening? And actually, it's a choir as the only people you can preach to, and the aim is to expand the choir. So you start with the people closest to you, and you say, look, here are the tools. Here's the tools for understanding where we stand, and here's the tools for changing it. And so let's use these tools, and you spread a positive message. It's got to be positive. You've got to show how things can change. Because if you just say, oh, it's all terrible. Oh, yeah, it's all terrible. Yeah, it's all terrible. Nothing changes. You've got to show it's all terrible, but here's what we can do to change it. And then you widen and widen that concentric circle, and you hit that 25% tipping point. And a classic example of people who did understand this and have done this brilliantly are gay rights campaigners. So if you think of marriage equality, just a few years ago, in most of Western Europe, marriage equality was going to be the end of civilization as we know it. Oh my God, if they allow gay people to marry, I'm going to leave the country. Yeah. And a few years later, those same people say, well, of course, I was always in favour of marriage equality. And they believe it. It's like after the war, everyone becomes a member of the resistance, right? And they all believe that they've always been in favour of marriage. You never had to persuade them. The gay rights campaigners very effectively expanded the concentric circles of acceptance until it tipped, and suddenly it went from 25% to very nearly 100%. In the UK, even David Cameron's right-wing government introduced the Marriage Equality Act because it had to, because the whole of society had changed. It couldn't be left behind, persuasion is greatly overrated as a political tool. It's actually, you convince the people close to you, but then it's a question of using that social tipping, and people don't even think about it. Persuasion suggests engaging the rational mind, and you engage the rational mind to the activist community, but then actually you just trip everybody else into that new social state, which is how society changes. And so this is a very hopeful thing. It means that change is much closer than we think it is. And in fact, there was a study done on Fridays for Future, looking at Fridays for Future up to the end of 2019 and showing how damn close it was to that tipping point. It was so close. European politics was about to tip green right across the board, and then the pandemic comes along, and everyone has to go home, and we've had to start again from scratch. And it's immensely frustrating, all the tremendous work that Greta and everybody starting in Sweden did and then spreading out across the world. We've had to start again. But it's also tremendously hopeful because we can see how close we were and we can do that again. And people despair because they believe they had to convince everyone. But when we understand systems theory, we see that that is actually not the case. Thank you.
So the tipping point, the good tipping point is 25%.
Yeah. I mean, it's quite a lot, and so there's quite a wide range of studies now, both observational and experimental, and they all converge on roughly, it's around 25%, around a quarter of the population, and I find that thrilling. That's really exciting. That's tremendously good news. It's just much more within reach than we thought, and also we can carry on talking to each other, just as long as each other gets a bit bigger every time.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts. So I'm going to come from perspective of research in ecology and social sciences, and I have 2 questions. The first one is, when listening to your thinking, I don't see you engaging at all with the notion of biocultural diversity. So what you talked about before about beef consumption and having this global chef who are spreading this idea of great to look at this ways you can cook beef could be, for some anthropologists, we talk about the great homogenization, like how across the globe we eat more and more the same. And I was wondering if you have engaged with that thinking, and thinking that maybe pushing for plant-based diet could be also a symptom of the great homogenization, and to what extent helping people to reconnect with their diverse ways of eating that often have much less meat could also be an option. And the second question is about context. So, for example, what you say, I'm more familiar with France, Sweden, and Australia. So what you say, for example, about grass feeding is very true in Australia in terms of deforestation and what it causes for biodiversity. But the situation is very different in Sweden and France, where actually from a conservation perspective, we are losing biodiversity because we are losing our traditional ways of farming. And actually reforestation is a problem because we are losing all the cohort of species that do depend on traditional farming landscapes. So I've been reading your articles, and I see that you often have a very global scale, but that can create the narrative that can have detrimental consequences for conservation at the local level and depending on context. So I wanted to see how you engage with context.
Thank you very much. So the first thing to say is that nothing in what I'm saying is about coercion or taking away things from people. I'm not saying we're going to ban it, we're going to stop it, we're going to force people to change. Far from it. I'm looking for the triggers for social change rather than any coercive social change. And you're right, I am trying to take a global view, and because people in rich nations eat massively more meat and have massively more damaging diets than the people that you're talking about in poorer nations, it is mainly aimed at us, basically, because we are by far and away the biggest part of the problem. It's there's nothing to stop, particularly subsistence farming. If it's outside the market, then it's much less affected by many of the forces that I'm talking about. And by all means carry on. I worked for a year with the Maasai in Kenya and Tanzania, and to a lesser extent with the Samburu, Turkana, and Barabaig. And I absolutely understood, the value of that system, which unfortunately is now collapsing thanks to land privatization and climate shocks. So a Maasai friend of mine just last week sent me the photos. All his cattle have died because of this huge drought in Kajiado region, which is now spread right across East Africa and the Horn of Africa. It's really, and it's getting worse and worse. It's sort of recurrent droughts. Smallholders produce about 30% of the world's food, and they are very vulnerable to environmental change, and this is a huge problem. This is a really huge problem. They produce great diversity of food, they help to create the backup systems, the buffering in the system, and they are on the receiving end of environmental shock. In many parts of the world, it will become too hot to work outdoors. Wet bulb temperatures will exceed 35 degrees, and that even if we manage to stay within 2 degrees, that's highly likely within very large areas which are primarily farmed by subsistence farmers. So, apart from anything else, we're going to need ways out. But I'm not saying that any of those ways out are going to be imposed, but we're desperately going to need them. But we should be trying to keep small farmers on the land as much as we possibly can. both for their own sakes, obviously, and the sake of local economies and cultures as well, but also because, from a systemic point of view, anything which is different to the norm is good. That diversifies the system. That creates backup systems, creates resilience, and the rest of it. But as the first question pointed out, we've switched towards what practitioners call the global standard diet very, very quickly. No one's forced it, but it's been a sort of convergence of culture, taste, advertising, price, all of those things. So we switched from a situation where, just a generation ago, every valley had its own food, its own distinctive cuisine, not always adequate, not always environmentally friendly, but clear and distinctive, different to that of even the neighbouring valley, let alone the next region. And now our cuisine has become locally more diverse and globally less diverse. So in other words, each one of us has a far wider range of products to buy in the shops than our grandparents did, but they're almost exactly the same range of products as someone of the same income group as us would have anywhere in the world. Pretty well wherever you are, you've got very similar supermarkets selling very similar stuff, and people are eating that very similar stuff. And there's been this great convergence, much more fat and protein in our diet, a little more fruit and a tiny bit more vegetables, surprisingly not much more sugar than 40 years ago. That's a big surprise. Actually, our ancestors were eating quite a lot of sugar. But and in some respects, for some people the diet has become healthier, and for some people the global standard diet is less healthy than what they were eating before. It's not consistent across the world. Now, the convergence towards the global standard diet, which helps to drive and is driven by the development of the global standard farm, is one of those destabilizing factors which undermines systemic resilience. So we need diversity within the system. That's absolutely clear. On the biocultural landscapes and whether they're more biologically diverse and the rest of it. So if you have a really tiny number of grazing animals, you can have such a thing as regenerative grazing, which from the ecological point of view, the absolute minimum baseline for ecological regeneration is trees being able to return to a formerly forested landscape, right? And I've done the calculations for the UK using various models. In the uplands, that means 5 sheep per square kilometre, 1 sheep per 20 hectares. It's the maximum stocking density, and in some places lower than that in the uplands of Britain. In the lowlands, there's a rewilding scheme which uses cattle and pigs and actually gives us a very good guideline because they've got just below the threshold at which trees can return, and they produce 54 kilograms of meat per hectare per year. If the whole of the UK was switched to that system, we'd each have 75 calories of meat a day and nothing else. So that's 1/30 of our calorific requirement. So in other words, if you are to move to a system which is ecologically regenerative and does maintain diversity by creating what ecologists call an intermediate disturbance regime, in other words, a habitat mosaic, which in some circumstances, and by no means all, does create more diversity than in a closed canopy forest, but by no means all circumstances, in some cases can, your stocking density has to be extremely low. And if that is the way you're going to produce meat, only millionaires will eat it. It will become an extremely valuable luxury product like beluga caviar or bluefin tuna. And I hear people saying, oh, well, no, we need to eat less and better meat. And everyone can have meat on special occasions. You say, sorry, wait a minute, what luxury product is distributed? Does everyone get one flight in a private jet every year? One super home to use a few days in your lifetime? It doesn't work like that. Luxury goods are highly concentrated. So if that's the way you produce meat, it will become the exclusive preserve of very, very rich people. Even the people who produce it won't eat it. Just like the people who catch bluefin tuna don't eat bluefin tuna because it's far too valuable to eat. You make far more money by selling it. And so it's just what the great mistake we've made here is to confuse an intermediate disturbance regime with a production system. They are totally different things. And by mixing these things up, we've created or allowed to be created a huge amount of confusion. The meat industry has played on that confusion and say, look, there's these studies showing that you need some animals in the landscape in certain circumstances to create diversity in certain guilds, not all ecological guilds, but only certain guilds, functional groups, that is, of species. Therefore, we need to be eating meat. They're totally different things. There is a massive category error which has been deliberately blurred by the meat industry. So we as environmentalists have to resist that blurring. We have to stick to what empirical studies show us, that these are not the same thing. Sorry, the question was, is there a risk that precision fermentation products get branded as animal feed and then people won't want to eat them?
Right.
That's a really good question which I've never been asked before, so thank you very much for that. And it's true that because of the regulatory restraints, because it takes so long to get regulatory approval in the EU for novel food products, some of the precision fermentation companies in the first instance want to target animal feed markets because it's easier to get approval. And that's really an artifact of the political regime. It's much easier in some other jurisdictions to get novel food approval. And it's interesting, I hadn't thought of it the way round that you put it, but you're right, if this starts off as an animal feed product, it could very well discourage people from wanting to eat it. I hadn't thought of that before, so yeah, thanks, really good question. So the question is, what is this natural ecosystem I'm talking about? I hope I didn't...
What is the human,
where
is the human in the rewilded...
what is the human element? I hope I didn't say natural ecosystem. I think I said wild ecosystem. Did I? Okay, well that was a slip. Okay, thank you very much. Well, that was a slip of the tongue. Sorry, I didn't mean to say natural ecosystems. I should have said wild ecosystems. Just because nature is a really complex... Raymond Williams, a great cultural critic, said nature is the most complex word in the English language. It means pretty well whatever you want it to mean, okay? But wild ecosystems are... That's a much clearer definition. It's self-willed ecosystems, ecosystems which aren't managed. Which might not be natural in that, well, what is natural? We can argue all night about that and get nowhere, right? Okay, so I'm sorry I said natural. I shouldn't. I meant to say wild. But yeah, so yes, there's no question that there has been intense human modification of ecosystems. There's a story that that enhances biodiversity. With intermediate disturbance regimes, it can sustain biodiversity. You can't create species. The human timescale, management timescale, isn't long enough to create species. To drive evolution. Because we're always, as soon as something begins, begin to get genetic selection to meet a certain set of conditions, we've gone and changed those conditions. So we're not creating biodiversity, but we can create circumstances in which biodiversity can be enhanced above the circumstances we were creating before. Overall, the human impact on the ecosystem has been an absolute catastrophe, and that began long before farming. In the Eemian period, which was the geological epoch before the last ice age, lasted about 30,000 years. Northern Europe had all the things that you're familiar with today. It had foxes, it had badgers, it had blackbirds, it had robins, it had elephants, it had rhinos, it had hippos, it had lions, it had... Yes, it had a megafauna. Everywhere had a megafauna. Everywhere on Earth had a megafauna, on land or at sea. Everywhere except Australasia had elephants and rhinos and lions. Australasia had its equivalents. This was universal, and we wiped them out everywhere except a few tiny remaining pockets. So, let's not pretend that we've done the world a favour. As a friend of mine, an ecologist friend of mine says, when confronted with these conservationists saying, we have to manage these reserves, how did nature cope before we came along? We have this sort of self-attribution fallacy which says, we created nature, we made all this, we're constantly hearing this. Mm-hmm. But there are some cultures which have lived alongside much greater diversity than others, and some cultures which are very good at trashing everything, and that can change. Cultures can change. Indigenous people in South America, when they first arrived, were an absolute disaster. Later on, many indigenous people learned to live very well alongside the remaining wildlife, but that was after wiping out the megafauna. In terms of food production, particularly livestock production, there is a huge gap in our perceptions and understanding of natural ecosystems, because we're constantly saying, well, this mimics nature. You know, this pastured cattle system, it mimics nature. Well, it's actually a very crude caricature, because, you know, unless you're in a place which was once a wild grassland, trees would have been growing there, and, you know, unless you really bring your numbers down very low, trees won't grow. Most of them exclude wild herbivores, but most importantly, they persecute the large carnivores. And, you know, the primary reason why we do not have large carnivores, where you would expect to find large carnivores, is the livestock industry. I mean, that's, you know, it's that, I know in Scandinavia, hunting also plays a major role, and the hunting lobby in Norway has been one of the major reasons for the decline of the wolf, both in Sweden and in Norway. And we all know that Norwegian wolf policy is an absolute catastrophe. But that's also driven by the fact that people run their sheep in the woods, and that's why lynx are persecuted as well. In the UK, we wiped out all our large predators, and we can't bring them back because of lobbying by the livestock industry. In North America, the livestock industry is the driver of this incredibly cruel and brutal persecution of wolves, of coyotes, of pumas, of bears. You know, they set cyanide landmines apart from anything else to kill. It's totally indiscriminate. They kill loads of dogs. They've killed at least one person. It's monstrous what they're doing, and large predators are absolutely fundamental to ecosystem dynamics and functions. So, you know, people say, oh, it looks like nature. Yeah, and what you constantly find in this debate is that you present data, and the other side presents pictures. It's pictures versus data all the time. I say, you know, livestock farming is driving the massive greenhouse gas pulses, methane and nitrous oxide. Here are the numbers, and people say, well, look at these cows grazing in the field. Are you telling me that's the problem? You know, and we have to become food numerate. We have to attend to the numbers. Now, we've very successfully got there, thanks to the Do the Math campaign, which started with Bill McKibben and others in the US. We got there with energy. We understand what the carbon budgets are. We know how much we can burn and how much we have to leave in the ground. We need to get there with food as well. We need to do the math on food.
And also for bringing up Brazil. I'm from there, and yeah, I know what's happening in this Cerrado. You mentioned like agribusiness taking over the whole land there. And it feels like this system is, as you mentioned, like ecologically speaking, is a self-regulating system that we don't seem to see a way out of it. And I would like you to talk a little bit more about the strategies for decentralizing the food system.
Muito obrigado.
What a great quick question.
Okay. Yes, I know. Yeah, strategies for
decentralizing
so,
the
I
food
mean,
system.
when it comes to the new food system with precision fermentation, a big part of that is we have to wage war on intellectual property rights. You know, this is so important everywhere. And a fundamental principle is that biological material should not be patented. You know, whether it's whole life forms, whether it's genes, whether it's molecules, we should not be allowed to patent those entities. Maybe there is arguments for intellectual property on certain processes, certain products, but you know, don't patent the biology, and we should be really clear about that right across the board. You know, wherever we're coming from, it's just fundamentally wrong because it leads to immense corporate concentration. But also, you know, we need governments actively to break up these big corporations, and that applies to Amazon as much as it applies to Cargill. You know, it's right across the board. We've let them take over, and there were many warnings in the past. If you think of the Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis in the United States, who warned that the private power of corporations will overwhelm government if we don't stop it. And he was one of the voices who brought in very powerful antitrust laws in the middle of the last century. But we just accept this as, oh, well, you know, these big corporations are just going to get as big as they can. Jeff Bezos is going to get as rich as he can, you know, and go put up endless metal fallacies to prove his manhood to himself, which he'll go up to space for 11 minutes in. And we'll worship at his shrine. It does not have to be like this. Humans made these systems. Humans can change these systems. And it is our conformity to the systems that have been created by corporate lobbying which is our undoing. We must stop conforming. We must stop obeying. People talk a lot. Another fundamental misunderstanding about human beings is that we're told that our survival instinct takes precedence over everything else. We will put our survival first. I see almost no evidence of this at all. For a start, people are altruistic, they'll look after other people, often in times of enormous stress and crisis. But most importantly, our obedience instinct keeps overriding our survival instinct. And again, we would rather obey than survive. You see this so many times, even in extreme situations under totalitarian dictatorships, people will queue up to be killed. It's in the most extreme and obvious way. But at the sort of planetary level, right now, we are obeying the system that's killing us. We are putting that obedience ahead of our own survival. And it's time to stop obeying. If there is one thing we need to do as citizens, and it's as citizens that we are most powerful, it is to disobey those who claim to exercise power over us. Sweden has the world's best examples of that, starting with Greta and the Fridays for Future movement. We build on that.
Excellent.